about the new skill set for the new QA specialist. And let me go into more details. But first of all, I'm not going to assume that you know who I am. I'm not a rock star, obviously. But this is me. I'm Joel. I'm like Iran, I have been testing for, I think, a little bit over 20 years right now. And I did start as an accidental tester. And I liked it that Jose Manuel yesterday also said it. And accidental tester, because back in the day, testing wasn't that big of a known profession. So many of us just got to it when someone asked us if we wanted to be a tester. And at the beginning, I didn't want to be a tester because basically I didn't think that it was a professional career. And it took a number of conferences and a number of basically watching people and learning to understand the depth of testing. And I love it. And that's what I do. And it's my passion today. I work at a great company called Practitest. I am their chief solution architect. And I also have a number of other projects, being that, well, this online test conf, state of testing survey with Lalit Kumar from Tea Time with Testers, and my podcast with Rob Lambert, testing one-on-one. But other than that, I have two big families. This is my big family. And by the way, someone asked, what is this? Because it looks like we're surfing and it looks like snowboards. No, they're not snowboards. No, they're not surfboards, but they are surfboards. This is what it's called sand surfing. And apparently it's a thing in a number of places. It's a thing in Israel where I live. So this is where we went to sand surf this summer. And this is my great family. And my second family is actually Practitest, the company where I have been working for the last number of years. And in case you haven't heard of it, it's a great SaaS QA management solution. Very intuitive, very simple, but also it serves as a hub whenever, in addition to being a test management system, where you can run your test case and manage your test case, manual test case for that. You can also integrate your other systems like Jira, other automation systems like Selenium or Eggplant, BDD, whatever you have in there. And it's being used by a number of companies, but I'm not going to go into that right now. I think that's enough. And let's start talking about what we came here to talk about. And we're here to talk about a skill set, but I think that it's important to define what's a skill set. Each of us has it. I think that we don't think about it as much as we should be thinking about it because it's actually pretty important. For many of us, it's trivial. We make the scene of not trying to work on it more. But a skill set is our own, and I like this term that I learned from one of my testing managers, Noam, about 15 years ago. It's our virtual toolbox. It's the set of tools that we have that will help us to do our jobs in one way or another. And some of those skills, some of those tools might be if we know how to do the exploratory testing, if we know some heuristics, the experiences that we've had from the bugs that we found, if you have theoretical knowledge or practical knowledge on something, even your attitude towards things. These are all what actually build your skill set. And it's important to understand each one of us, we have our own skill set that has been shaped and formed by our experiences and the knowledge that we've had. Okay, so it's very, very important. The question then becomes, do we need a new skill set? Meaning, guys, we have been doing testing. Many of us have been doing testing for a while. And maybe we don't need a new skill set. Maybe we have all the tools that we need. But the truth is that no, definitely no. The world is changing. The world is changing rapidly. And if what Iran told us about the differences and the movement in automation is not enough, we could have seen the presentations from yesterday, and even the way that if you take Adidas, for example, and Jose Manuel's presentation, the way that they're reinventing themselves all the time, the world is changing all the time. And we need to understand that change is usually an evolution more than a revolution. And by that, I mean that if you look at anything that it sticks around, anything that doesn't work like a pendulum where you change something and it goes back, it needs to be an evolution. Most revolutions in the world, even the French Revolution, if you think about it. So in the French Revolution, people just took the king down. Basically, they cut his head. And a number of years after that, France actually had a new king. So revolutions usually tend to go backwards after a number of years. Evolutions take you forward, and you don't see a way back. And that's important because I think that testing as a profession is constantly evolving. If I look back at my career, if I look back at what made me a good tester 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it's completely different from what makes me a good tester today. And that is because testing is constantly evolving. If we're constantly evolving, then the important thing to understand, or to try to understand, because it's not always trivial when you're starting, is where are we headed? Why do we want to know where are we headed? Because if you know where you're headed, if we know where will the challenges be in 5 years from now, then we will know what tools, what skills do we need to develop in 5 years or in the next 5 years. So we want to know, but it's actually kind of complex to know it. And it's kind of complex because any time that there's an evolution, then it's usually being caused not by one factor, but by a number of factors interacting. And so when you have a number of factors, then it becomes more and more hard to try to understand where are you heading. But I did put my head together on this, and I sat down and I talked to people and I reviewed some data. And I actually came down with 3 main factors to help me try to understand where is the testing evolution taking us, sorry for that. The first factor that I realized, I think is very important, and most of you will agree, is the evolution of the development practices in the world, how development has been modifying in the last number of years. And if we take a step back and try to understand what has been happening, then, well, even before I started testing, we had the waterfall model. And the waterfall model basically said, yes, you have phases, and you start with requirements, you create a design, you implement it, you test it, you deploy it, and you maintain it. I'm not going to go into the details of that. It's called waterfall because you always go down. And if you need to go back, then you need, again, to redo the following phases as waterfall. And it was a good method. It was a method that actually was pretty good at the time, so much so that it actually evolved into what we call the V model. And the V model, it's nothing more than the waterfall model, where next to each one of the phases that we had, we actually assigned a matching testing phase that we needed to do. So during the requirements phase, you could start writing down the acceptance test. And during the specification phase, you could start writing the system test and so on and so forth. So it was a way of basically formalizing testing as part of the process. And it was a very, very big step forward. This was more or less the time where I actually got into testing. But what happened was that we realized that market was a lot faster than what we intended it to be, and that we could do things better. And so back at the end of the 90s, we came up with iterative processes. And if you think that iterative processes, that Agile, it's new, guys, it has been around for 20 years. Maybe you haven't noticed, but XP has been around for a long, long time. And the idea of the iterative processes was to say, hey, you know what? We're going to work in smaller chunks of process. We're not going to take, in my time, it used to be 12 or 18 months to release a project. We will work in 2-week sprints, 3-week sprints, and we will be able to gather more and more feedback, or faster feedback, into what we're doing. It's going to be a more stable and more, well, obviously agile, but efficient process. Then people realized that it was, or the iterative process, especially agile, was not so much a process as kind of an approach. And so we try to make this more processes like Kanban and stuff like that. And what we have today, and unless you have been living under a rock, you actually are aware of that, it's what is called DevOps. Now, DevOps, if you understand, it basically means that we have the same team or the same group of people who are writing the code, testing it, and then they release it and operate on the field. Even how we got to DevOps was an evolution and was a convergence of factors in itself. And if we look at it, how did we get to DevOps? So on the one hand, I was talking about agile methodologies and iterative processes, where we're basically, instead of working in cycles of 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months, we're working on sprints of 2 weeks, 1 week, or 3 weeks. And so we're basically having products ready on a very, very high rhythm. We're actually working at a very, very high cadence of releases. And on the other hand, we actually had the evolution or the appearance of the web, the World Wide Web. So on the one hand, we are releasing products faster. On the other hand, the World Wide Web meant that we do not need to ship our products any longer. If we have a website, we don't ship disks to another team. We tell them, hey, here's the code, go ahead and deploy it. And if there's a bug on the code that we're running ourselves, then it's easier to fix and solve. So we don't have the inconvenience or the high price of fixing bugs. so we can actually start working faster. And then we want our operations team to work faster and faster up until the point where it makes more sense to just integrate between both teams and have an integrated operations and development team. And so we get to DevOps. And again, I'm killing the process. I'm over simplifying what happened, but it was also a convergence of factors. But I'm digressing here. I just wanted to show how this convergence actually came through. And so let's jump over to our second factor. The second factor affecting, if we already talked about how processes in development evolved, then let's talk also about how testing teams have evolved. So one of the things that I do, I run the state of testing survey with my friend Lalit. We run it every year. It has been running for 6 years, and we ask questions of about 1,000 or more testers every year, and we ask them sometimes the same questions in order to see how the testing world is evolving. And if you're not aware of the state of testing survey, please go to our QA blog and sign up, because it's a pretty cool project, and the next one is going to be running in January. So I have here 5 questions that we have been asking. The first one is a question where we ask what is the percentage of testers, the percentage of companies where you have 5 testers or less. And if you notice here, back in 2016, you had about 35% of respondents to this survey, and it's been jumping all the way up. We're close to 50% right now. And that means that in many, many organizations, we have less than 5 testers. And that basically means that we have less testers per developers, because what we see is that the amount of developers is going up, but the amount of testers is going down. And I think that we've all seen it, meaning we have testers working as part of agile teams, we have less people doing testing, we might have other people doing testing. Let's actually talk about that. If we ask the same people what percentage of their tests are being done by non-testers, and this was the other question that we asked, and these are the results for 2019, then you might jump and say, hey, you know what? Less than 10% is going to be half the people who answered that. And if you start by looking at that, you might miss the point, because yes, so we have over 50% of organization where most of the tests are being run by testers. But if we look here, we will see that we have about 10% of organizations where either half or less of the tests are being run by testers, which means that half or more of the tests are being actually run by non-testers. So we're seeing more and more organizations where non-testers are running a bigger part of their testing. And the third point that we actually asked in here is, and I will make sense of all of them together in a second, is how much of your time, and remember, we're asking testers, are you investing in testing operations? And again, between 3/4 and all of their time being invested in testing was about 51% of the people. But we see here a number of people where half their time or less is spent on testing, which means that half their time or more is being spent in non-testing tasks. So if we take these 3 points, that we have less testers in the companies, we have more tests being run by non-testers, and we have testers that are also investing their times in non-testing tasks, then we need to understand that the way the testing team works have been modifying or is being modified as time actually passes. The third factor, and again, there are many of them, but I want to talk about this one because it will make sense, is what I call the professional evolution factor, and that is how testers have evolved in a sense, and let me explain how that looked. So let's say back in the day, 20 years ago, if you were a tester like myself who started doing testing, your profile would have been a crossbar. And by crossbar, we mean you would have been a person who knows how to do a large number of things, but maybe you don't have a lot of depth into how you do it. So you know how to install software, but you're not an expert on that. You know how to work on browsers, but you're not an expert on that. You might know how to do some scripting, but you're not an expert on that. So you're basically jack of all trades, master of none. What happened was that as time evolved and some specialized tools started coming along, namely load testing tools and maybe automation tools, then we started hiring people who were I-shaped. And by I-shaped, I mean these guys are experts, but only on one thing. So I remember bringing an expert on Load Runner or an expert on WinRunner to work on my teams. And it was great. These guys could actually come up with the scripts. But I remember also that the moment that we needed them to go out of their tools and run some regression manual test cases, they said, oh, no, I'm not going to do it because I only do load runner, or I only do win runner, or I only going to do language testing. And these guys were basically snobs. And obviously that didn't work so well. So we started seeing people who are more T-shape. And T-shape meant, yes, you might be an expert or something, but you won't snub out of doing a lot of other stuff. That worked for a while. And then we started seeing people who became pie-shape. And I think that Agile actually pushed this a lot, because if you were part of a cross-functional team, that obviously you need to do testing, but you also need to know maybe another two things, maybe automation, maybe a little bit of load, maybe a little bit of security testing. So that came along, and with time, then we started seeing what we call now the broken comm. And the broken comm is the model that we have right now, especially in DevOps and Agile teams, where people do have a very robust background on almost everything, and we're not afraid to become quasi-experts on many, many areas. So that is how, let's say, the profile of the tester is looking more and more today. So if we take these three factors together, then we can see how testing and testers have been evolving over time. And so it won't be a surprise to understand that testing methodologies have also been evolving. And in order to understand how they have been evolving, I want to, we have been seeing here that if we started with the waterfall models back in the day, and we moved over to the V&W models that were very common 20 years ago, and then we started working more on iterative and agile processes, then my bet is that what is starting to happen in a number of organizations today, and it will continue happening more and more as time moves along, is that we will move into approaches or methodologies that are more aligned with the modern testing approach. And if you were not if you were yesterday, this is what Ana Maria was talking about. I also mentioned this a little bit. If you haven't, then even though this is not a modern person, talk a little bit about it because it's very important. You can go to this link at the bottom, angryweasel.com, maybe testing, modern testing, or just go to moderntesting.org and read what's there. It's basically a set of principles that are explaining how, quote unquote, modern testers are shifting the way that we work and how we should start focusing on other areas. And I think that the summary of it, it's the mission of modern testing, that it's to accelerate the achievement of shippable quality, in a sense that we're not only focusing on testing, we're focusing on a broader perspective of quality and how to accelerate that as part of a team. Not only or not necessarily doing testing, but doing a whole bunch of additional things. So again, I'm not going to go into that. I will leave that to what Ana Maria said yesterday. We will be sharing her presentation and what these guys also have to say. But it's important. I think that we are evolving as a profession as well. But let's go back to our skill sets. This is what we came to talk about here. One of the things that I get to do, I guess, more than I would like to, is to travel a lot. And I have been in incredible conferences this year. One of the things that I do in my job as a system architect is just to travel to our customers worldwide and see how they're testing. Obviously, we talk about the tool, but you also talk about how they test and why they test and the problems that they have and the challenges that they're having. And one of the things that I do, just to exemplify this, is whenever I actually travel, I have this custom with my wife. I take a selfie of myself on the plane. I send it to her. I can take also some kind of pictures of the plane looking. So these are only some of the pictures of the last year. You can also see my evolution with a beard for the last year. But if you look into the number of companies that I have interacted in the last year, it will look something like this. Some of them I have visited. Some of them I have only talked to. And these are testing teams. These are teams of testers who are either working in practice tests or working with other systems. And we get to talk quite a lot about the way that they're testing and the skills that they need to develop. And these together with the state of testing report have given me a good information on what we need to do as testers. And it has given me a very good background in order to understand what testing skills do I need to have as a tester today. So in preparation for this session, I basically went over to Google. I love the way that they can do very, very simple mind maps, but there again, hundreds of mind map systems over there. And I did a mind map for my new skill sets. If I want to define myself as a testing professional today, which are the skill sets that I should have? And with this in mind, I went over and started working on them to make sure that I have better skill sets. A good thing about this is that I have been working on this Google as well. And as I go to other conferences, then I also add more information in here. So it's basically my own living mind map. And I think that everyone should basically define their own. This is mine. You can take it if you want as an example. But I think that each one of you, every person actually listening to these sessions should go ahead and create their own mind map, because it's virtually impossible for you to need my skill sets or for these to be your own skill sets. But I want to use this as an example and actually talk about my skill sets as an example for the skill sets that you might want to develop yourself. And what I want to do is I want to go through each and every group of this and basically explain which are the type of skill sets that I think we should be having if we're going to be testing professionals in the new world. Let's start with constant learning. I think that this is the most important one. And the reason that I put this picture in here is because this is the exemplification of constant learning. This kid obviously is learning to ride his bike. He fell down, but be sure that after falling down, he basically got up and continued riding his bike. And this is something that I told my 3 kids. All 3 of them know how to ride their bikes, thank God. But when we were learning that, they told them, hey, if you haven't fallen down 100 times, you haven't learned how to ride your bike. Because it's not about how do you fall, it's about how you don't fall the next time, or how do you get up and don't fall the next time. So these are the constant learning skills that we should have. If I look at the 3 main things that have to do with learning skills, I think that the most important one is going to be critical thinking. We need to ask questions. We need to ask our own personal questions, even if they're going to be very hard. We need to all the time try to analyze the answers to those questions objectively as much as possible. Even if we're working, again, even if you have been investing a year of your life or more in specific areas, you need to learn to say, hey, you know what? I made a mistake. I need to do something else. So try to go ahead and do it. Be critical about yourself and have that second point of self-criticism. Self-criticism is not that person who is so negative that thinks that whatever they're doing is bad, even though I have it myself. And again, hand in heart, I think that I was sure that the presentation that I was about to give yesterday, it wasn't good enough when I was working on it, but then I got great feedback and it was great. I was overcritic of myself, and that's one of my biggest flaws. But you need to have it, because if you constantly think that you're okay, then you're not going to improve. And the other point, and this is something that Dwayne, a great guy, he was here talking, I think a year ago. He has been talking quite a lot about deliberate practice, and I think that it's incredibly important. And in a sentence, the difference between deliberate practice and practice is how much of your mindset and how much of your thoughts are going not only on practicing but improving as part of your practice. It's very, very important. Okay, and these are constant learning skills. And again, just to explain a little bit, what does all this have to do with the 3 guitars in there? That's a picture of my study at home. The 2 guitars on the sides are mine. The one in the middle are my kids. It's a little bit smaller. And the reason it's there is because up to about, 3 years ago, I didn't know how to play the guitar. I'm not good at it. But one day I told my wife that I wanted to buy a guitar, and she told me why. I said that if I don't buy a guitar, I'm going to go and buy a sports car because I'm passing a midlife crisis. And she said, hey, go ahead and buy a guitar. It's going to be less expensive. And so I went ahead and I bought a guitar, even if I had never played a guitar enough. And never played a guitar at all, sorry. And I started learning, from YouTube channels. And today I'm a little bit better than I used to be, only because I'm doing deliberate practice on that. So it's very important. If you don't know what deliberate practice is, go ahead and learn it. Okay, so it's important skill to have as part of your skill sets. Second skill set family that I want to talk about, and we cannot get away from this, is going to be your technological skills. Now, I want to start by saying, yes, you say technological skill. What is the first thing that pops to your mind? If you're normal, then it's going to be automation. Oh, you need to know how to write automation. And you know what? Yes and no. I think that the single most important technological skill that you as a tester in a technical industry, a software testing and software development is, you need to know how to script. But scripting is not necessarily automation. There are many things that we do scripting. For example, I do more scripting parsing logs than I do writing automation scripts. You need to know how to do scripting if you're going to be working with your CI or your CD or your deployment systems. And as part of testing, especially if you're working on a DevOps environment, you need to know how to deploy your product internally. If you're working on data analysis, then you will need to write some scripts, at least some queries, in order to generate good graphs. Obviously, if you can write test cases, do it. There's data generation using scripts. There's quite a lot of reasons to use scripts. And the reason that I'm saying this is because for many people, writing a computer language might be frightening. I know it was for me. 10 years of my life I spent secretly being afraid to write code because I thought it was very, very hard, until I didn't have a choice and I had to learn. And I learned something very simple. I started learning HTML and CSS and a little bit of JavaScript. And today I know how to write simple scripts in different systems. So it is going to be important to do that. So go ahead and try to learn those simple scripts if you can. But technological skills do not stay with automation or scripting. As I mentioned, there's quite a lot of other tools, technological tools that you need to know how to work with. CI platforms and processes, and I don't care if it's going to be Jenkins, TeamCity, Circle CI, Bamboo, whatever you're using, you need to know how to work with them. You need to know how to manipulate them. You will need to know how to deploy. You need to know how to add quality measures to that. Security testing, it's mainly technological. It's mainly about running scripts and try to understand how to hack into systems or what security flaws you have there. Obviously, mobile devices, it's very, very important. A lot of the work that we need to do on mobile devices is going to be technological in nature. If it's going to be the deployment or cleaning them up, stuff like that, all of that is going to be very important. And we also have working on the cloud. If you're going to be working on, if your company is cloud-based, then you need to know how to manipulate, for example, AWS, Azure. I don't care if you're working on Google or stuff like that. Try to understand how that works. And last but not least on this area, it's going to be everything related to containers. Regardless, again, if you're working on Docker, Kubernetes, or something like that, containers are very important because they will allow you to get environments up and running very, very quickly. If it's going to be your internal environment for testing, yes, you will need it. But also if you're going to be, and I'm going to be talking about that, ensuring that your developers test better is going to be faster. It's simply going to be something that you will need in order to make your tests more efficient when you're working on all-team testing or in general as well. So all of these are my technological skills, but I think that many of them might be shared with other people in here. We are still testers, and if you were in my presentation yesterday, then you understand that even if the whole team is going to still be doing testing, we will need to do the test management. And so the methodological testing skills are going to be very, very important because we will need, at least myself, need to still lead the testing operations within the team. So under this category, I think that the skills that I like to have are, first of all, test planning. Even if everyone will be doing testing, even if you're doing exploratory testing, you need still to prepare yourself. You need to analyze what do we need to test, how obviously execute those test cases, analyze results, and report them. It doesn't matter if the planning takes 5 days or 5 minutes. If you tell someone to go ahead and test something and that person doesn't think about what they're going to test beforehand, then they're not going to test completely. They're not going to test correctly. So we need to know test planning. We need to teach test planning. Another methodological skill that is very, very important is going to be prioritization of test cases. Not only of test cases, even of user stories. I have a newsflash for you guys. Even if you're working on an Agile team or DevOps team, did you know that you can name the amount of time that it's going to take you to test something as an attribute that will help you to prioritize the user story? So if you have a user story that will be very simple to right, but very hard to test, then you might be able to get it to you faster so that you can test it for more time before you need to finish your sprint. That is something that many of us do not take into account. Also, there's the part about testing in production. So we need to understand, okay, which test cases, which scenarios, which areas do we need to test before we deploy the system, or what can we test in post-production? What's important, what isn't? All of that is going to be very, very important to you. And also very important is going to be reporting. Many times, especially if a lot of people are going to be doing testing, it's not trivial how do you put everything together in order to provide good information. Okay, what has been tested? What hasn't? What are the results? Are they similar to what we were expecting? Are you benchmarking stuff with previous sprints or previous releases? All of that reporting will require you to basically know methodological skills on how to approach your testing. And if you're the person who has the testing hat in your team, then all of these are skills that you will want to have and even expand. My personal favorite, and maybe because I like speaking, I don't like speaking in public. I will talk about that in a second, but I tend to speak a lot in meetings. My wife tells me that all the time. It's going to be communication skills. Now, as an anecdote here, remember that I said that we run the state of testing survey and report every year? We have been running it for 7 years. Every year, we ask people to basically grade some testing skills that are important for testers, and we put automation, and we put security, and mobile, and methodologies, and stuff like that. Every single year, the highest rated skill has been communication skills by every single person who's actually working. So we know that communication is important, but we usually tend to underestimate what do we mean by communication. If you ask me, the skill that we testers are worst at is going to be active listening. How do we gather information? The most important part of active listening, you know what it is? Keeping quiet. You need to ask a triggering question and then keep quiet so that people can actually talk to you about it. For me, it's really, really hard, but it's something that I'm actually working on. Active listening, it's not only to listen to what people are saying, but even their body language, trying to understand what they mean, not only what they say. So that is actually going to be a good skill to develop, and you can go ahead and search it over the web. Another communication skill that is very important for me is going to be coaching. I usually see it also as persuasion. How do we get others to do stuff for you, to become good at things, even if they might not want to do it? So there's quite a lot of training. There's quite a lot of showing people what they're doing. There's quite a lot of being a cheerleader next to someone and doing it better. So it's going to be a very, very good part or important part of communication skills, but these are not the only communication skills that are important. I think that graphical representation are an essential side of communication skills. Can you put together a good dashboard that will provide all the information that you have? Different people will need different data at different time. How do you make sure that everyone actually understands what you want them to know? How do you raise their interest in that? Public speaking, it's very important. Both internally, how do you communicate with the team? If you're in a meeting, how do you keep quiet and know when to talk? And externally, how do you talk with customers and with an audience? And professional secret here, I hate speaking in public. I remember being in a session with about 250 testers, 300 testers, and speaking, and the first 5 minutes are always terrible because you have butterflies in your stomach. I can even tell you that today, before we started the sessions earlier today, I was also incredibly anxious, but you learn to cope with it. And I'm not saying that you will start enjoying it, maybe you will, but at least you will stop being afraid of it. And the best way to do it is just to jump into that pool, get off with that water is cold syndrome, and start swimming. Okay, public speaking is very, very similar to that. And just as a reminder, if you want to speak on our next online test conf, get in touch with me and we will help you to do that. Moving forward, to leave time to some questions. There's a skill set that I'm not sure a lot of people talk about, and that is testing enablement. And we have been talking about the fact that a lot of other people in the organization is going to be doing the testing. I talked about it yesterday. But how do we make sure that they can test and they can test effectively? And when I look into testing enablement, I usually divide it into two main areas. How do we adapt our testware, and how do we create the infrastructure so that everyone can actually test correctly? Starting with the first one, with testware adaptation, is how do you create artifacts, testing artifacts that will help other members of your team, being them programmers, product owners, support people, even your customers, test better. And so we need to understand that not every test needs to be a exploratory test based on a charter or a scripted test based on a very low level script. You have other alternatives. For example, you can generate personas and user profiles in order to help people visualize their users better. And personas is not just to say accountant that works with the system every Monday. No, it's to go into the fact that this person is working with multiple applications. Maybe your application is going to be used by an old person or a very young person. All of those attributes that will help me to try to relate more to the person to understand what's important to them or not. Another incredible tool that it's very good to use if you know how to use it correctly is what I call light scripts. They're very similar to the testing scripts, the scripted tests that we have, but you scale them down in order to fit the person. If you're gonna tell a business person to run test cases for you on their application, let's say that you're deploying an ERP system, you do want to make sure that you're specific enough so that they know what areas you want them to touch, but you don't need to explain to them how to press each button or how to fill every field. So try to scale down, in a sense, the scripts that you're using. And yes, it's okay to generate test case specifically for specific areas. I know that I do it all the time. The use of checklists and heuristics, and Michael Bolton was criticizing me yesterday for something that I said here, that heuristics, again, you cannot just throw a heuristic to a developer and use it. No, you need to teach them how to work with them, and he's 100% right on that. But you can still use them, and you can teach people how to work with checklists better. Some people like checklists better than complete scripts, and it's okay. Remember that you will use a checklist not for the first time you're running the same test. Use a checklist for the 100th time where you're running the same test. And you want to make sure that no one will forget that small step that today might actually have a bug behind it. So that's important, and heuristics will help people to come up with testing ideas faster for themselves without you needing to do that all the time. That was with regards to how do you modify your testware. Let's talk about how do you generate testing infrastructure. Now, a big problem with our industry, if you say the words testing infrastructure, the first thing that people will think about is your automation environment. I don't mean that at all. Testing infrastructure is everything that will help me do my tests better. Yes, it might be an infrastructure to run my automation, but not necessarily. In this case, definitely not. One of the most important things to do when you have someone starting to do testing is to teach them how to test. How do we test? Why do we test? Especially for non-technical people, you need to explain to them that testing doesn't mean just running the sunny day scenario. It's actively looking for exceptions, actively looking for things people might have not thought about. It's going to be very important. And I see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to start running a little bit faster. Remember that we talked about containers? We're talking here about testing environments. How can we make sure that our developers are going to be testing in systems that are not clean, with data that is has interesting information in it so that they will be able to find the bugs? All of that is going to be important. And it is our responsibility as testers to make sure that we generate that for other people who will be running our test cases. A skill set that I had to learn the hard way in the last 5, 6, 7 years is how do we work in production? And it's very, very hard if you think about it. How do we switch over from a place where you think that you need to test everything before you release the product until a place where you feel comfortable releasing systems that you know for a fact that you haven't tested all the scenarios in them, because you know what scenarios you want to test before, and you know how to basically act if something was to go wrong in production. So when we talk about work in production, I start by thinking about instrumentation. If you're not going to be testing everything before you release it, then you need to understand that you will want to know what is happening in your production environment. That means that you need to have eyes and ears into what's going on in there, and that means that you need to instrument your code correctly. Think not only about how do you instrument it, but also how do you measure that? How are you going to be able to discern between interesting exceptions and not interesting exceptions? All of that is going to be a big deal. Deployment strategies are also very important, not because you want to know how to deploy on sunny day scenarios, but because you want to know how are you going to react if something goes wrong. If you look into this IKEA kind of diagram, okay, so you start by doing something, then you do something else, then you drink a couple of beers, and then you splinter your finger, and then you have a headache for that. So how are you going to be reacting if something actually goes wrong? It's very, very important for you to be that person that makes sure that you tested not only the deployment, but also the rollback structure. I was talking about instrumentation. The only reason for having instrumentation is to, not the only, but maybe a very important one, is to enable your monitoring. Just as if you have a patient who just had a cardiac issue, you want to know what's going on within his chest. The same you want to know with your code, specifically if you're just releasing it. So you want to understand what is happening, and you want to know it fast. You want to have alerts, and you want to have displays. You want to, if your system is going to go down at 3 a.m., you want to make sure that you know that not at 6 a.m., but at 3 a.m. when it happens. Ideally, you will know that 10 minutes before, when the database starts getting high or the resources in the computer starts being low. You want to have those alerts in place. If you're going to be having quite a lot of data, how do you analyze the data? Data analysis and data sciences become a very, very important tool for us. And obviously, live problem solving. How do you keep calm when you know that everything is down? Because if you lose your mind, it will be down for more time than it would have if you wouldn't ask before. Last one on the list here is going to be what I like a lot. It's actually called, I call it quality or on testing. Some people call it shifting left. And it's everything that is not directly related to working with the product, but maybe validating it. So I think that we all need to become better at how do we validate user stories? How do we make the right thing at the right time? How do we work more on feature and product validation? And remember, now we are working in post-production, so we don't need to guess. If we release a feature, we can see how it's being used, how it's being adopted. We can ask customers, we can release an MVP, and then track if people are working with that in order to continue generating that. You can work with customers, you can ask them. If you cannot ask your customers directly, go to your customer success team, go to your support team, go to your sales team. Try to either work directly with your customers or with proxies to those customers. And with that, basically, I covered most of my, or all of my skill sets in here. I'm just about time because we're almost out of time. Just a couple more things before I go into questions. Remember that it's not about copying my skill sets. It's not even about trying to understand the specific skill sets once and then forgetting about it. The train is actually moving. You don't want to be left behind. What you need to do is to understand that the future is changing. No one knows for a fact where it's going. I have an idea of my future, and I might be completely wrong. So the only way to do it is to keep your eyes on the ball, to be focused, and to adapt. Adapt as much as you can to your environment and to whatever is going to be modifying around you. So I'm not going to go over this. I think that we covered most of it. So I'm just going to try to go over a couple of the questions. We have about 2 minutes, and I will then continue answering questions on the Slack channel as much as I can. Okay, there's a lot of things about the presentation. Guys, I'm going to be sharing my presentation later with other people. And I think that we're almost out of time. So I do recommend that you try to go over this, try to generate your own mind map. And again, continue working from this on. And if you have any questions, go ahead and send them to me. You have here my address. This is my personal address. And I'll be happy to take on the conversation moving forward. So with that, guys, it's now the top of the hour. We're going to go out on another break at this point. And following this break, we will go back to our next session by Thomas Haver, who's going to be talking to us about test automation firehouse and how to be both strategic and tactical at the same time. So thank you very much. And again, we will continue in a couple of minutes. We're going to go out on break. Thank you all.